Hi. So it's Christmas Eve, and since the United States federal government is feckless and dumb, there's still a pandemic outside. So being mostly stuck in my house by myself for the better part of 10 months means that I've finally gotten around to making the video series that I always joked about making. So anyway, this is going to be a show about Chicago where everything is made up and the points don't matter, or something like that. Guess we'll have to see what it becomes. Today, I would like you to join me on one of my favorite types of adventures, which is using old maps to answer a silly or oddly specific question. So, today, that question is, why does Garfield Park border Washington Boulevard while Washington Park borders Garfield Boulevard? There's actually a little bit more history behind this one than I expected. Involves several different municipalities and government agencies, a grand plan for the future of the city, and the death of a United States president. So this is Chicago. You probably know what it looks like. We have a tendency to name things very uncreatively or oddly, such as Lake Shore Drive, which is named after a lake, Canal Street, which is named after a canal, Ashland Avenue, one of my favorites, which is named after coal ash dumps, which is a really attractive thing to name a street after. So here's a map of the city. Over here on the west side, we have Garfield Park. And then down here on the south side, we have Washington Park. You can kind of make out some of the little bits of the boulevard system that kind of wanders through the city. There's a bunch of other little smaller parks connected to it as well. Here's Garfield Park. It's got some lagoons, sports fields. There is a gold domed field house, which is oddly spectacular. There's a plant conservatory, which is very, very cool. There's a little bit closer where you can see here's that gold domed field house, and then as you can see, Washington Boulevard kind of meanders through the middle there. And this is Washington Park. It's got also some sports fields. There's little lagoons in the bottom. This is a high school up at the top there. And as you can see, out the western edge here is Garfield Boulevard. So since the neighborhoods that are surrounding these parks are they're both named the same thing as the park. Garfield Park is in Garfield Park. Washington Park is in Washington Park. The boulevards being the opposite is really the only kind of odd thing there. So we can see back in the day, I think this map is from 1872, that naming convention did exist to a certain extent. So we have, this is Garfield Park there, used to be called Central Park, and then there was Central Park Boulevard. There was Douglas Park down here and Douglas Park Boulevard. So yeah, like I said, Garfield Park was originally known as Central Park, which is where the name Central Park Avenue originated. That street still exists. It's at 3600 West. And the park has a Green Line station that's called Conservatory Central Park Drive. Here's a couple maps from the 1880s. They show a little better the full extent of the Parks and Boulevards system. And this was a system that was largely imagined and built out before a lot of these areas were incorporated into the city of Chicago. So and here you can see the city limits actually stop right here. Only these colored parts up above are incorporated into the city. And over here, I think was about the division. This all over here is Hyde Park Township. And then this was Lake Township. Sometimes they were also known as Lake Village, Village of Hyde Park, other various things. Things were not super formal at this point. The city was only established in the late 1830s, 1837. So it's still very new. Things are growing very, very quickly at this point. Here's a 1930 map that shows pretty much all of the current annexations. There's a few that happened after this, O'Hare predominantly, but you can see that Village of Hyde Park down here is all still not part of the city technically. So there was in 1869 three separate districts created to build out this parks and boulevard system that was gonna at the time they envisioned it surrounding the city. Now it ends up that it's all very well within the city limits because it got way bigger than that. So these three were called the Lincoln Park Commission, the West Park Commission, and the South Park Commission. The South and West are the ones we're going to be talking about today. And as I said before, we are very creative about naming things. This was just, where they were with relation to the city. And here, these maps are from 1880. We can see over here Central Park, which later became Garfield Park. Down here we have South Park, which later became Washington Park. And we got Lakeshore Park here, which became Jackson Park. All the boulevards connecting all of these. And then up here we have Lincoln Park, which is kind of on its own. There's not really a true boulevard that connects it to the rest of the system, which I think is unfortunate. Missed opportunity there. Over here we can see that the Washington Boulevard name was already in use at the time. So this is kind of our first little clue. So if we look back to 1876 and even further back to 1863, we can see that a lot of the old loop streets with the presidential names are already in existence. These are pretty old. These are almost as old as the city itself. So, like I said, that's our first step in figuring out our little naming coincidence. Here we can see on a map of Hyde Park and Lake Township in 1872. We've got the South Park name over here, and then what became Garfield Boulevard is called Pavilion Park Way. And then in 1881, President Garfield was assassinated, and this prompted the renaming of a lot of different parks in the system. Namely, the West Park system renamed their Central Park to be Garfield Park, and then the South Park system renamed this Pavilion Park Way to be Washington Boulevard. At this time, this was still a separate municipality, and this was still a separate parks system. Hyde Park Township was annexed into the city of Chicago a few years later in 1889. And then another few years later in 1895, the state of Illinois passed some legislation that allowed voters in newly annexed areas of the city to establish local park districts. Illinois has an obsession with creating redundant and unnecessary units of government. I think at this point in 2020, we still have the most individual school districts out of any state in the US. I may be wrong about that. I haven't looked it up in a while. But anyway, the Lincoln, West, and South Park systems still all existed at this point, even though they were all pretty much entirely incorporated into the city. Um, so those hadn't really expanded a whole ton. And then as the city kept annexing other areas, the people would vote if they wanted to create other little local park districts. So by 1934, 19 of these other little local park districts had been created, and they decided that that was not really working out super well. So this was consolidated into the current Chicago Park District, and that's been operating ever since. So, in conclusion, way back in the day, Washington Street name already exists. That just continues on west with the grid as the city expands. Later, when the parks and boulevards get built out, Washington Street becomes a boulevard between there and Madison. And in the 1850s, this was when residents and planners started to propose the parks and boulevards system. Then in 1869, the three major park commissions were all established locally. Again, these were all pretty much in separate municipalities at this point still. The same year, the South Park Commission opened South Park in Hyde Park Township on the south side of the city. Um, then that same year again, the west area where Central Park and later, Garfield Park area, that was also annexed by the city. And then in 1874, that is when Central Park opened by the West Park system. Then in 1881, both Central Park and West Park were renamed to their current names, and also Pavilion Parkway was renamed to Garfield Boulevard. Then in 1889, Hyde Park Township was eventually annexed into the city during an election. And then finally in 1934, the Chicago Park District was established to consolidate the 22 local park districts that were now dotting the city of Chicago. So basically, it's just a matter of these names both existed separately in different places, and then those two places ended up being one place after a long enough amount of time. And so the names end up being kind of weird. And this wasn't really anything that anyone did on purpose, which is kind of what I was hoping. Like, I really hoped some planner was just like sitting there listing out the names of the president and did this on purpose, because that is absolutely what I would do. That is basically my entire strategy for playing City Skylines. Uh, but it's actually more just a matter of history and the order that the specific details happened in, which is typically what it turns out to be. I find that most of the time when you look at something in a city, or like urban planning wise or design wise, you're typically going to be able to trace it back to, something specific. If it's weird, it's usually not accidental. It usually, if there was an opportunity to make it not weird, then somebody probably would have done it. So if there's a weird thing out there, it can probably be explained, usually by maps, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, bye.